Have you ever sat back and just waited for something to come along? And you're waiting and you're waiting and you're waiting and you're waiting. And then you just kind of forget about it. And then all of a sudden, it just pops up in your face. Warpugs, here comes a Russian ship name that I don't care to pronounce. This is from the History of Everything, and it was requested by Acme Boy. Acme Boy, you keep on making these requests, dude. They're great. This is The Russian Navy Sucks Part 7. The man has made his own movie series. We're here for it. This is about the Russian submarine with the inner hull made of titanium and how it fell victim to... I'm going to just pause a second before I say this, because every single time we talk about the Russian Navy, we have to talk about one thing. Their ships are just apparently made of fire, and that's all they're ever made of. We're gonna jump right into this. The Komsomolets. I don't care. Let's go. Let's just go. I wonder how bad maintenance was on this piece of crap. Of course, Warpug's History of Everything is a friend of the channel. All of his links are in the description down below. And I am so glad he's okay from when he made the decision to eat a Russian MRE with Laser Pig. Leave a comment, like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. Let's get right into it.
Bullied. I'm not even joking. I was all done with the Russian Navy series, which is why I released the supercut of all the parts together. And out of nowhere, one of my admins has been mercilessly bullying me just to make one more video in the series.
You could make 17.
And I'll be honest, I had some ideas for future videos in the series, but I stopped it because, well, I didn't want to just milk the Russian Navy dead, because, well, I got bored. You can only talk about sadness so much before you get sick of it. So, instead of getting a video on the current Russian naval ooft in the Black Sea, yes, that video is actually coming. I'm doing it. It's called The Battle of the Black Sea, How Russia Lost the Naval War to a Country Without a Blue Water Navy.
I can't get over it, man.
You're getting this video.
Let's go.
You can thank Neha in my Discord. It's all her fault. Okay, not really. She did twist my arm a bit and has messaged me quite a bit about doing it, but I'm being a bit dramatic for effect here. Let's talk about another Soviet submarine, though.
Let's go.
A very late one, with quite possibly one of the saddest stories that just reeks of all the misery that was the very late Soviet Union, with all the hallmarks of stagnation. Let's talk about a submarine that perfectly encapsulates how and why the Soviet Union fell apart. Let's talk about K278, Komsomolets.
Komsomolets, okay.
Class submarine with a tragic but classically Soviet and Russian ending. Like, comment, subscribe, and let's get into it.
God, it's so bad. Let's go.
Komsomolets began her life in the Rubin Design Bureau as Project 685, as an attempt to leapfrog the Western powers with far more advanced nuclear-powered attack submarines that could carry a mixture of torpedoes and cruise missiles, with a nuclear option for the latter.
And I'll give you two guesses what this thing had on it. You're only going to need one.
Laid down in April 1978 at Severodonetsk as Hull K278, being launched about 5 years later, in June 1983. Joining the fleet that December. K278 was a little different from other submarines, with a distinctive double hull, the inner hull being built from the very expensive titanium. This unique and very pricey and hard to build design, because titanium is a pain in the ass to work with, allowed the submarine to theoretically dive far deeper than its American counterparts. Given her ability to go this deep, the designers decided to include within the submarine 7 compartments, stronger forward and aft bulkheads, the idea being to create 2 sort of safety zones in case of emergencies in the second and third compartments, and also an escape capsule fitted within the submarine's fin above both of these compartments should anything go wrong. The idea of a submarine going so deep is actually really interesting. See, the purpose of it is that being able to go that deep, you'll be below thermal layers. And by being below these thermal layers, enemy submarines won't actually be able to hear you, so you can effectively just crawl along the bottom like a catfish.
A lot of this has to do with the way sound goes underneath water. There are technically layers to the ocean, and almost what you could consider rivers and lakes and ponds in the ocean, where sound just moves differently through them. So I understand this chart on a very fundamental level because I used to work with sonar.
And then pop up or shoot straight up into the enemy submarines and completely destroy them. It's a really, really intelligent idea. It was believed that the submarine was initially powered by 2 liquid-cooled reactors in the west, which caused a fair bit of panic at the possibility of this thing zipping around at depths in the Atlantic, like Lightning McQueen on meth, but it was later found out that it was just a single conventional Soviet reactor. It is possible. Now, it's possible. We don't entirely know this because the Russian archives and Soviet archives are completely shut and have been forever, because God forbid someone actually try and criticize the state with the actual evidence that the state has, that the Soviet Union wanted to put a better reactor or better propulsion system in the submarine. We don't actually know because, well, Soviet submarine.
Yes.
The submarine could potter along, therefore, at a very respectable, quick 26 to 30 knots underwater, which is pretty comparable to Western subs at the time, and up to about 14 knots on the surface. Again, pretty comparable.
Yeah, when you're looking at subs, you're not looking for how fast they can go over water, though, because if you're on the surface as a submarine, you're getting beat to hell and back.
Swanky new metal tube also included some significant technical upgrades compared to older Soviet submarines, with many of the systems having the intention of being automated to reduce crew size and also cost. As such, the crew was as small as 64 men with 30 officers, 22 warrant officers, and 12 petty officers.
Yay!
And enlisted. A very top-heavy command structure, but again, that's pretty standard for submarines. Unironically, the Hunt for Red October explains better than almost any historical source why Soviet submarines had very officer-heavy crews, but also very non-commissioned officer-heavy crews. It's very much based on politics, whereas, for example, a sonar operator would likely be an officer or a high-ranking non-commissioned officer in the Soviet Navy. It could be something simple like an enlisted man in the US Navy. And it really just comes down to different philosophies.
And levels of trust, because in Soviet Russia, nobody really trusts anybody at all. And if you're a sonar operator, you can hear what frequencies the Americans are coming in on, which means you have access to secrets that could damage the Soviet Union if they were released, even though we already knew all that.
K278 was armed with the usual 6 tubes, sporting the aforementioned missiles and torpedo armament. In all, the submarine was 117.5 meters long, 10.7 meters wide, and had a draft of up to 9 meters, clocking in between 5,000-ish tons on the surface and about 8,000 submerged. Now all the techie, boring stuff is out of the way.
Yay!
Sort of. There will be some more later when we get into the misery.
Yeah.
We can all get into the absolute horror that is yet another episode of the late Soviet Union at sea.
Yeah, it's about to get
you
bad.
Might be asking just quickly, what is a Komsomolets?
I have no idea.
It means a member of the Komsomol. So what is a Komsomol, you may ask, in a slightly more annoyed and passive-aggressive tone, while crossing your arms? Well, Komsomol's full English title was the All-Union Leninist Young Communist League, effectively a youth organization for the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. In its earliest form, this little Lenin youth was founded in 1918 as the Russian Young Communist League, and would later be spread amongst the entire USSR. The Komsomol was actually the final of 3 organizations a good party member and proper little communist would theoretically join before actually joining the proper party. In order, they were the Little Octoberists, the Young Pioneers, and lastly, the Komsomol.
People smiling in Russia. This is definitely propaganda.
The idea being that these organizations would ensure that above all you behave and that you become what the state wants you to, and you find your purpose within the party and the state.
Uh-huh.
These days, there is a spiritual successor to the organization called the Movement of the First, which was created 2022 by Putin to teach the youth a worldview based on traditional Russian spiritual and moral values. And goals. Like drinking heavily and beating women, mass
He didn't have to go there. We already understood that it was a complete and total joke.
murder, kidnapping children and stuff. Traditional, modern Russian values.
Remember, if you're not dying in the human wave, you're not doing your job as a proper Russian.
In the modern state. But I digress. Let's get back to the submarine.
Okay. The big oopsie. This title's already going great.
The submarine would be sent out on a third combat patrol in April 1989 under the command of Evgeny Vanin. The submarine was patrolling a region of the Barents Sea, effectively the Soviet backyard, not too far away from Norway's Bear Island, just a few days sailing from their home port. The submarine was running deep during this patrol, and on the 7th, a fire broke out.
Who would have thought? A fire on a Russian ship? I just no way! Just that's impossible! Especially a submarine!
Within one of the boat's engineering compartments. It is likely that the wiring was the culprit. At least that is the official story, and there's no real reason to disbelieve it, because the submarine suffered in construction from the ongoing material shortages, and because of this, the work done wasn't done to the best standard.
Oh, really?
It appears that what happened was that the pressure of being submerged...
What had happened was... God, it's... Oh... Fire and Siberia. Two things about Russia you can't deny.
As it was designed to do, caused a hot oil leak, which sprayed onto the submarine's electrics that could not be isolated within compartments. The oil, effectively spraying out of the engines and out of the compartments, was sprayed directly onto the wiring, which itself was not protected correctly from
Would have thought?
things like, hot stuff. Like fire. The fire continued to rage on, and it could not be isolated within those special compartments. The crew slammed shut the watertight doors as fast as possible, but it did nothing to stop the fire, which kept spreading through the boat's cables. The cables not having a way to be isolated compartment to compartment and connecting throughout the entire boat. The reactor was quickly scrammed to avoid, it detonating during a giant fire, and the boat lost propulsion. This all reportedly occurred really, really quickly, and there was really nothing the crew could have done. They did everything perfectly here. With their options exhausted, no propulsion, no way to move the submarine at all, the hull filling with flames and smoke, the crew tried to evacuate, blowing the ballast tanks and trying to get to the surface. The officers sent out distress signals, while the men were ordered to abandon the boat. The compressed air system aboard the submarine, though, made matters worse here, with the oxygen mixture being far too rich and just feeding the flames with effectively fuel.
God, I knew this was stupid. I knew how this submarine went down. I heard it was because of a fire. But seriously, man, you just wonder why is it always like a comedy of errors that happens on board these damn things?
Gutting the inside of the boat's vital compartments, the fire would continue burning until about 3 p.m.-ish local time, where the boat would begin to sink in about 1,600 meters of water, around 250 kilometers from the Norwegian coast. Captain Vanin and 4 others meanwhile stayed aboard, desperately trying to get help for the crew who had abandoned the boat, again doing everything right. And it seems that they were caught by surprise when the submarine finally went down. The 5 men rushed to the escape pod, which failed to work correctly and flooded.
Of course.
4 of the 5 men, including Captain Vanin. Again, just another case of rushed construction without thought given to it doing its job properly and costing lives.
As long as it looks good, as long as the damn thing looks good, don't worry about how much it screws up.
The efforts of the captain did pay off though, and his sacrifice wasn't for nothing because the rescue aircraft arrived quickly, dropping rafts, but the reality was that the sea was horrifically rough, and the conditions meant that their use was impossible. On top of that, the ocean temperature was only 2 degrees, which to put it in perspective, is a similar temperature to the water the night the Titanic sank. 81 minutes after the sinking, the floating fish factory, Alexei Klobuchar, arrived, but like with the Titanic, it was just too late, and many of the crew had died from hypothermia. Of the 69 crew on the Komsomolets at the time of sinking, 42 would die, 30 of those from the cold water.
Oh my
But
god.
why did the K278 go to the bottom? That isn't a silly question, and no, I'm not just referring to the fire. Yes, obviously that sank it, and generally speaking, floaty things sink when water gets in them. Yes. But the sinking of the K278 is at its core the ultimate metaphor for the dying USSR and the corpse that the Russian Federation now inhabits.
Stagnation!
Now, I've been through the misery party that was the Soviet Union in the 1980s before, but it really applies here, and it is really important to know. See, the USSR was a top-down bureaucracy, with a state being centered around the powerful General Secretary and wider Politburo. This is all a fancy way of saying it's a dictatorship with extra steps.
Yeah.
Nominally, the General Secretary only controlled the Communist Party directly, but given that the Soviet Union was a one-party state, well, go figure.
Yeah. It tends to happen when you start encouraging things like communism. Communism, because of human nature. Now, granted, communism on paper is probably the best form of government. Everybody gets what they need. People, take care of themselves, all this other kind of stuff. But communism put into practice, once you introduce a microscopic amount of human nature, immediately turns into one of the most authoritarian, genocidal, worst possible ways to live, period.
In order to maintain this control, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, yes, that's the actual title, and the Politburo relied on a series of councils, with each industry having its own councils and a series of deputy directors running top-down. You can really see this within the ministries of atomic energy, but also within the ministries of defense, with powers centered around powerful ministers in Moscow and series of less powerful ministers under progressively less powerful ministers until you reach individual nuclear power plants, bases, or dockyards. Think of this as a giant Marxist pyramid scheme with more sadness and less Tupperware. The
Less
atomic energy
Tupperware is always
department
good.
really explains these problems the best, and it's also the most well-known and least hidden within the archives that we can no longer access, so I'm going to use it as an example here.
Go for it.
Within each power plant, there would be a series of similar positions in ministers and directors until you reach the plant staff itself, and within that staff itself it would continue. The Chernobyl disaster would later highlight just how ineffective this structure could be, but it would also highlight, and this is something that defense really highlights as well with things like the Kursk, the ability for scapegoating when something goes wrong.
Yep.
Ultimately protecting those at the top, namely the Politburo, the General Secretary, and by proxy, the integrity of the state itself as a force for quote-unquote good. Further to this, these progressive deputy directors and secretaries were unelected and put into place by people in more powerful positions. This kind of structure allowed the Soviet Union to survive scandals caused by avoidable accidents, because it protected the integrity of the state and saved its face.
Huh.
The goal of the Soviet state, and the reason for this kind of government structure, was the theory of the collective state's goal. An example throughout Soviet history is the 5-year plans, and the centralization of the state's resources for what was deemed to be the collective good, which in reality made the country stronger, so it made the government stronger, so it's a vicious cycle. This rigid government structure would absolutely destroy the Soviet Union during the Brezhnev era, with the Soviet economy being unable to provide, and because it was all collectivized and it was all relying on itself to feed the state, we now enter the era of stagnation. And there's not really any way to come back from this. And this is where the pain really begins.
Yay.
The consequences of the era of stagnation and the Soviet political structure came to fruition both with the Komsomolets, but again, using Chernobyl as an example, with the Chernobyl nuclear power plant on April 26, 1986, just a couple of years before our submarine goes down. The destruction of the plant and the sheer scale of the disaster was hidden from the public and the world, including the nearby town of Pripyat, just like the disasters in the Navy were hidden from the people. Just like the Kursk would later be attempted to be hidden from the people. The cause of the actual explosion that destroyed the plant, obviously being that hidden fault within the reactor, that was hidden specifically to protect the state.
Right.
Because it was too expensive to replace it. Sounding familiar? This whole disaster, Chernobyl, and, well, the Komsomolets, it's violently late Soviet. But it's all made worse. See, all these lies could theoretically be made okay if the builders actually had the resources to build the things they're being told to build.
This is so this corruption was such a huge problem. Lack of resources, on top of corruption, on top of what was beginning to become a runaway inflation, on top of all the other problems that were being held back by the Soviets basically engineering everything they could to keep afloat. The second that the Soviet Union, the Politburo began to lose actual power, the entire apparatus fell apart. There was no hiding it anymore. And they had been in a losing economic battle against the United States for decades at that point. It honestly was only a matter of time before everything just completely fell over. And there's other countries in the world right now that are in similar circumstances. They're breaking their backs trying to keep up with an economy, and they're doing it in one of the worst ways possible, and you can see the collapse coming. Even if they're not willing to admit it to themselves, you can see the collapse coming. You just got to know where to look.
Workers could not actually build the products they were told to build. The plant director Brukhanov in Chernobyl was actually given the order to build the plant within an allotted time frame and to provide a certain level of power to the grid, just like the builders of the Komsomolets were told, build submarine that goes deep and really deep and deeper than American submarine. Brukhanov's way around this was, well, I need to build the plants, I need to build 4 reactors by this date, and then I need to build 2 more after that, so what I'll do is I'll combine reactors 3 and 4 into one building. Bad idea, for one, in order to save money, and because I can't actually put gravel and other things on the roof to seal the roof, I will cover it in tar. Highly flammable tar. The Soviet government does not care as long as the work is done because, oh, look, we've built the reactor, we've done what we need to do, it's done. Go Soviet Union. And it's the same thing with the submarine. We've built the submarine. It doesn't matter that the wiring is not contained and all fire is able to be put out if it starts in the wiring. It doesn't matter that it's not covered properly. It dives, it's a submarine, it does what it wants and does what we need it to do. Now you may be asking, Ho, this is supposed to be a video about a Soviet submarine. Why the hell are you talking about Chernobyl so much?
It fits. It fits so dynamically well because you cannot build something big and flashy meant to house something extremely dangerous, meant to carry out specific roles. This is the reason why quality checks are such a big deal, are such a huge deal when you've got companies here. If you have companies in the United States that do not deliver a product that is reliable, nobody wants it. Well, like, you can buy a brand new microwave all day long. The thing could display time. It could have an LED screen. It could have connect Bluetooth to your smartphone. But if you plug it up and the thing starts smoking and turns off after 15 minutes, you're never going to buy that brand again. You're just never going to buy that brand again. It's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. Yet, this is how the Russians put together their crap.
Well, like I said, it's because it's the ultimate allegory for the state of the Soviet Union during this period. See, the Atomic Energy Department was the funded part of Soviet infrastructure, just like the defense spending. This was the funded part. In terms of defense, the issues at Chernobyl were so clearly there, and in some cases much worse. The K278, like I've been saying, went through all these pains, and we can see it so clearly in the boat's construction. As the Soviet Union fell apart and the economy broke down, the order to build a highly complex titanium submarine would require special care, and funding would need to be provided to each part of the submarine. The wiring suffered here from the era of stagnation, and shortcuts were made to get the boat into service. One of these shortcuts, like I've been saying, meant that the submarine could not isolate her compartments if a fire occurred, because the fire can always find a way. Fire will always find a way. It's like water. It will find a path. The submarine's demand to dive extremely deeply meant that her ballast system was under immense pressure too, and because this was the first submarine of the type and money simply wasn't there for extensive testing, a sort of alright, let's just do it approach was taken. And yeah, this approach worked twice for the first 2 patrols, but the reality was that the boat was a time bomb, because the moment the fire started, you had an oxygen system pumping oxygen onto a fire. The care and attention simply was not shown to the construction of the boat.
No!
This is a lesson that was learnt the hard way by the United States after the Thresher and the Scorpion. Simply put, the Soviets just could not do it, not in the late 1980s, not doing something that they should have been doing since the 60s, but were so obsessed with saving face and catching up that they ignored it. The Komsomolets was an awesome concept, a sub that could dive deeper and harder than any other, but she was built on a shoestring budget by workers experiencing the very worst of the era of stagnation. So why did she sink? Well, yeah, the fire did it, but she went down because she was a Wunderwaffen built by a dying regime.
Huh.
Would you believe that regime also planned the Kursk?
Yes.
The sinking of the submarine should have been the end of this horrific story.
No.
A full stop on the horrific nature of the cost of stagnation.
Here comes the really stupid part. I know he's going to talk about it. Prepare yourself, Warpugs, because we're about to reach maximum stupidity.
A disaster that, had it occurred at any other point in history, would have made headlines. But the danger was far from over, because the K278 went down with 2 nuclear torpedoes, and 8 others, mind you. The Norwegians were not at all pleased at the fact there were 2 nukes sitting on the bottom of the ocean right next to their territory, and under pressure from the Norwegians and still trying to get a little goodwill, the Soviets sent a research ship, the Keldysh, to search for the wreck. I guarantee you actually know the Keldysh, because it's the research ship from the movie Titanic.
Really?
Not. Small world, right?
No kidding.
In June 1989, the wreck was located, some 2 months after its sinking, but in typical Soviet fashion, they turned around and said any leak was merely insignificant.
Of course they did.
Posed no threat to the environment. Naturally, given Chernobyl had just done its best Hiroshima impression, nobody really trusted a word the Soviet government had to say.
No kidding.
But it did appear that the weapons were intact and not causing issues to marine life. And so the sub stayed on the bottom, rusting away as the Red Banner came down for the last time in December 1991, and the Russian High Command, who claims to be the one true successor state of the Soviet Union, hence why this is under the name Russian Navy Sucks, continued to pretend the submarine was not a problem, even while the Kursk went and blew up. In 1993, meanwhile, Vice Admiral Chernov pushed against the grain and founded the Komsomolets Nuclear Submarine Memorial Society to help provide for the widows and orphans of the lost boat.
Thank you.
The society would later have to be expanded in order to help all lost Soviet and Russian submariner families. That's a significant number of sailors. In 1994, Russians actually went and examined the wreck again, only to find that the plutonium was now leaking into the sea through fractures in the hull caused from her impact on the ocean floor. On the 24th of June 1995, the Keldysh was again tasked to sail to the wreck, this time to seal the fractures and entomb the radioactive waste in the forward torpedo compartment to finally stop the leaking. The work done by the Keldysh meant that the radioactive material would remain locked inside the boat until the mid to early 2020s. At which time more work would need to be done, or the torpedoes would need to be removed, lest they poison the ocean. Ever since news about the disaster broke, the Norwegians have actually kept a really close eye on the wreck, sending teams annually to examine the water and ocean bed, to ensure that the environment is not killed by, well, leaking plutonium torpedoes. In 2019, a joint Russian-Norwegian team found that together that the work undertaken by the crew of the Keldysh was failing, and that radioactive material was beginning to seep through into the sea.
Hooray!
Nowhere near to dangerous levels yet, but it was increasing.
Maybe one day I will get my kaiju.
As we currently stand, the Russian government has made no effort when it comes to fixing this problem.
Of course they haven't.
Seemingly happy to just ignore it and leave it on the bottom of the ocean, knowing full well the West will just pay to fix the problem, and this isn't the first time. Western donors have had to pay Russia before to actually get rid of nuclear waste to stop the environment from being poisoned and turn uninhabitable. Given that the Russian government right now is obsessed with saving face and has turned into such a sad state that it relies on ammunition from North Korea and Iran, it is unlikely they will care to do it.
No, they won't do
But
jack.
That's the tale of the Komsomolets. It isn't comical, it isn't fun, it's sad and horrific. And yet, it is the perfect encapsulation of why the Soviet Union fell apart, and how that culture and thought process carried forward into the modern Navy. And this is why, and say it with me folks, the Russian Navy sucks. I really wasn't going to do any more videos on the Russian Navy, but to be honest, I have been prodded constantly by my mod team and friend to make this thing. This, along with her reels of just the most horrific Midwestern cooking in which mayonnaise is deemed spicy, meant that I either had a choice to watch them or just hurry up and make the video lest I be tortured to death. But either way, I hope you enjoyed it. Consider this the beginning of Season 2 of the Russian Navy.
Oh.
Yeah, that's right, I didn't stutter. Season 2.
Season 2.
Like, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you next time.
This is still better than the Rings of Power. Oh my god. Warpugs. I just want to know. Like, Russia, as it stands, mystifies me as a nation. It really does mystify me. Because they're obsessed with their own... They're more obsessed than a teenager about how people view them. I've never seen anything like this before. No other country does this. They're obsessed with looking a certain way to their own citizens. But God, it's just it's utterly asinine to look at sometimes. Yes, this particular submarine is a perfect example of the Soviets in their complete and total downfall. Just oversight after oversight, shoddy work, and who pays for it? Who really pays the price for it? Everyone else, and of course the Russians who die in it. This, if you look all the way back at the beginning of where we watched the Pacific Squadron, the same problems are they just don't get fixed. They just do not get fixed. You have poor training, you have shoddy workmanship, you have a lack of QA, you have a lack of focus on things that actually are supposed to matter, like quality. You have a nuclear powered sub and you do not have wires that are housed correctly in it. This is why weapons development and vehicle development costs so much money. This is why in the United States, programs like the one that assembled the Bradley and the one that assembled the Abrams cost in the billions, because the sheer fact of the matter is we're trying to get the best thing we can possibly put together. Now sometimes that doesn't happen. We get some really weird projects, Zumwalt. We get a whole bunch of promises made that are going to go absolutely nowhere, but at the same time we don't do crap like this. The last time you heard about the United States Navy being this abjectly incompetent or having this terrible of maintenance or anything like that was the USS Forrestal back in the Vietnam era. It's the only time you heard about it, because after that crap happened, we made massive changes to the way that we approach everything about what we do. Warpugs, history of everything. And I know she bullied him into making this, and I'm glad she did. I'm glad she did. Warpugs, I'm going to take off from here. Leave a comment down below. Check the links in the description below for all of History of Everything's links and my own. Join the channel as a member or a patron for early access, and I will catch you guys next time. I just can't, like, every single time I think about one of the worst clusterfucks in the history of mankind, the Russian military comes at the top of the list. Period. I'll catch you guys later.